1 Corinthians 15. Who is part of your spiritual heritage? For me, my spiritual parents are also my biological parents, but that isn't true in every case. For example, my grandpa was a first-generation Christian, so for him, somebody else outside of his family had to share the gospel with him and was his spiritual father. How far back could you trace your spiritual heritage? That could get pretty complicated and be very difficult to do. Theoretically, it could be possible that someone could trace their spiritual heritage back to the original eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ, the original apostles. Well, why does that matter? 1 Corinthians 15 says that Paul gives the Corinthian church's spiritual heritage as one of the reasons to hold fast to the truth that they have been taught, especially foundational truths like the resurrection, which is a lot of what 1 Corinthians 15 has to do about. So please follow along as I read 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. As I read, notice the Corinthian church's spiritual heritage that is listed in this passage. And when the lineage reaches Paul, notice which word he uses to define himself. He repeats it 3 times. Verse 1. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. Did you notice the word? What was it? It was grace, right? When it gets to his part in the Corinthian spiritual heritage, he defines himself by the word grace. So this will actually be my 3rd sermon in kind of a series that I'm doing on the subject of grace, specifically in our sanctification. Yes, we're familiar with God's grace in our salvation, but I find that often in our sanctification, the idea of grace is misunderstood. So that's what we've been focusing on the last few times that I've preached. First, we talked about how we are trained by grace. Maybe you remember Titus 2:11, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us how to live. Then about a month or so ago, I preached a message called We Are Equipped by Grace. God's grace to us is so abundant. We looked at 1 Corinthians 9:8. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times you may abound in every good work. And today's passage, we're going to see that we are defined by grace. We are defined by grace. Mia and I agree that marriage did change some things. Your life changes when you get married. But I think a bigger change was when we had kids. Okay, so when you're first just married, you're adjusting from, okay, you get one whole pie to, you get half the pie. But that's still a lot of pie, right? Okay, but when you have kids, you have an ever increasingly smaller sliver of pie, right? Even if you're a mediocre parent, even if you're a less than average parent, parenting involves sacrifice. Okay, there's a lot of things you might wish you could do that you just can't do. And do your kids understand the sacrifice that you're making to them? Not at first. When do they start understanding when they have their own kids, right? Okay. Tim Keller explains a common experience for many parents. I brace myself for this moment. Your kids reach their teenage years. The time comes when you have to cross your kids' will. Okay, and you're not even being like overly strict or anything. You're just telling them to do something not self-destructive and stupid, okay? But you have to tell them no, and they fly into a rage. At that moment, they look at you in the face. That kid you've sacrificed for far more than they could ever understand, and they say some version of something like this: you only care about yourself. You don't love me. In fact, you're only doing this because you hate me. You're currently ruining my life, and I hate you. Okay, those could be extremely painful moments. I say that kind of as a joke, but probably most parents know that experience of some sort. It can feel like they're questioning your love, your credibility, your value as a parent. And this just feels so unjustified and disproportionate. So how do you respond as a parent? Well, either you can just kind of withdraw, give up, and let them do just whatever they want. Or you come in guns blazing. I'm going to show you exactly, I'm going to tell you, sit down, I'm going to show you exactly how much I've done for you. You just hammer them over and over again, okay? I think we know that neither of those reactions are ideal. So in the moment like that, when you're dealing with difficult people, it may be your kids, it may be your parents, it may be whoever it is in your life that is being difficult, questioning your credibility and value, how are you going to respond? A lot of your response depends on whether you define your life by grace or not. So in order to understand this concept of being defined by grace, you have to understand what does not define me, what does define me, and what I should do about it. So what does not define you? How was Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church? You know anything about the book of Corinthians or the Corinthian church, you know their relationship was a little rocky, okay? Paul was having a similar painful parental experience with his children in the faith, the Corinthians. They were a church planted by Paul. He's the one that led them to the Lord in Acts chapter 18. So Paul pleads with them in 1 Corinthians 9 and says, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you're the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." Okay, he's pleading with them. But how do the Corinthians respond to Paul? This one verse kind of characterizes their attitude. Okay, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. That's 2 Corinthians 10:10. All right, they found some other cool kids to follow. They're like, you know what? Dad's not cool anymore. Paul's not cool. There's some other people that have some speaking gifts, and they're really cool. We want to follow them. You know, Paul's, thanks, but your time is done. But it gets worse. Look at verse 8. Now we're in our passage, or we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We're in verse 8. Now at the part where Paul is talking about himself in the Corinthian spiritual lineage. Now look at verse 8, and notice how Paul's talking about himself. But I want you to know that most commentators believe that these negative statements are not just Paul's view of himself, they actually reflect what the Corinthians are saying about Paul. And Paul here is just acknowledging what the Corinthians are saying about him. Okay, so look at those phrases. They call him last of all and untimely born. Okay, get this. That phrase, untimely born, think about it. Untimely born. It means at least premature, or in Paul's case, maybe post-mature. It's also the same word as the word for abortion or miscarriage. What they're saying about Paul is this. The other 12 apostles, they arrived normally, on time. You know what, Paul? You're at least post-mature, if not, you're the freak of the litter, okay? You're the one that came out of order. You came later, referencing Damascus Road, right? Okay, you're not normal. You didn't walk with the Lord like the rest of them did. Okay, you're the freak of the litter. They even say he is the least of the apostles. This may even be a jab at Paul's name. The name Paul means small. Could be even just jabbing at him there. You know, you're the runt of the litter. All these insults culminate in you aren't worthy to be an apostle because you persecuted the church of God. All right, these people are cutting deep here. You think Paul feels that? You think he has some regrets about his previous life? Yeah, they're going real deep here. They're jabbing him where it's sensitive. So let me ask you, who in your life thinks you're unworthy? Is it your kids, your parents, your spouse, boss, peers? Sometimes it's even somebody in the church. Who is it that could be saying something like, you aren't good enough, you aren't doing enough, you don't have enough, you just aren't enough? Or maybe they're not saying anything, but it's the silent ways they treat you. It's the cold shoulder, ignoring, overlooking, maybe just indifference. Well, let me tell you what Paul learned here in this passage. He learned what does not define him. First, I am not defined by what others think of me. I am not defined by what others think of me. They can say what they want, but I don't find my credibility or value in what others say. But isn't it true that sometimes the hardest insults to swallow are the ones in which there's a little bit of truth? Is there some truth to what they're saying about Paul? Yeah. Okay. You think Paul knows that? Yeah. Okay. Although these insults, they probably do reflect what the Corinthians are saying, you can't get around the fact that Paul is acknowledging them. He's saying, yeah, I am the least. I am the miscarriage of an apostle. Like, I'm owning it, okay? I persecuted the church of God. Paul did not become an apostle like the rest of the 12. His testimony is in Acts chapter 9, the Damascus Road. And because he was different than the other apostles, he could have felt inferior to them for those reasons. So maybe there was part of Paul that felt like he was unworthy to be an apostle. So let me ask you, what are your insecurities? Where in your life are you most prone to think that you are unworthy? Are you plagued by thoughts of, I'm not? I wish I was this. Why can't I be like them? I'm embarrassed of, okay, the list could go on. We have those insecurities, but Paul also learned, I am also not defined by what I think of me. Okay, I'm not defined by what others think of me. You know what? But even my own thoughts, I'm not defined by what I think of me. I can turn off the voice inside my head because even my own thoughts of me don't determine my value. But whether it's Paul's thoughts of himself or the Corinthians' thoughts of him, all these thoughts are being fueled by very real failures in Paul's background. We know some of what those are, but let me just ask you, how many Christians did Paul beat? You don't know. More than he would like to admit. More than even the Corinthians knew about. How many did he kill? How many fathers did he bind and cart away from their families? Okay, we know he was at least part of Stephen's martyrdom. You want to talk about some legitimate regrets? Paul had them, okay? He has a past. He has some burdens that he could have struggled with. So where are your regrets? What are you ashamed of in your past? Let me just encourage you on that note that you are also not defined by your past failure. You're not defined by your past failure. Let me tell you about someone who did define their life by their past. There was a famine in the land. Her family moves to a foreign land to find food, but her husband and 2 married sons die there. She's filled with grief and despair. She even tells her daughters-in-law, just go back to your people and to their gods. Okay, this reflects a lot of how she's feeling about Yahweh, the God of Israel, at the moment. But Ruth famously replies, where you go, I will go. And when they return to Bethlehem, the whole town does not recognize her. Grief does something to you. They could probably see it on her face. Is this even Naomi? They ask. Naomi's name means pleasant, but Naomi, because of her past and what happened in her past, what does she define herself by? Don't call me pleasant anymore. My name is now Mara, bitter. If I can summarize my life in one phrase, it is bitter. Some of us, like Naomi, may be tempted to make our identity the bitterness of our past. Maybe not everything, but events, something that happened in your past that's haunting you. And before we move on, I want to point out the difference between Paul and Naomi. Okay, did Paul have a choice in what he did? Yeah, okay, he actively chose to persecute Christians. Did Naomi have a choice in what happened to her? No. Did she choose for her husband and sons to die, the famine, everything that happened? Did she choose that? No. So whether you are the perpetrator or the victim, in your story, in your past, the part of it that could haunt you, the principle still applies. You are not defined by your past. Okay, but not everyone just has this deep regret in their past. Nobody has not everybody just has these failures, mockery, insecurity in their life. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead in the passage a little bit, but as we're considering what does not define us, look at verse 10. Paul says, I labored more than them all. All right, what does that mean? Does this mean that Paul's work ethic was just better than the other 12? Maybe. Paul was incredibly ambitious. Does it mean the accomplishments of his labor exceeded the others? Maybe. I mean, Paul planted a ton of churches. If you read Acts, his ministry is unmatched. It's incredible what God did through him. It could be said that he did more to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth than all the other disciples. But is that how Paul defines himself? No. Okay, so Paul learned that he is not defined by what others think of him, by what he thinks of himself, the failures in his past, or the successes in his present. We are also not defined by the successes in our present. What have you done that you're proud of? What have you done that makes you feel most worthy? We would be fools to define ourselves by any of these things, including our successes. So where do we find our credibility and our value? If you can't find it in any of those 4 things, where can you find it? Well, look at verse 10. How does Paul define himself in verse 10? After those few verses, I read this first phrase as a cool breath of fresh air. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. If you are a child of God this morning, you are defined by grace. So we talked about what does not define you. Now let's talk about what does define you. If you're a child of God, you're defined by grace. Now think about this for a second. How did the Corinthians see Paul? Obviously, a lot of insults, pointed out his weaknesses, his failures, his flaws. He's the least of the apostles. But how does Paul respond to that? Okay, does he defend himself? Does he come down on them, guns blazing? Hey, sit down, let me show you exactly how much I've done for you, lest you forget. Nope. He calmly acknowledges everything they said about him. This is Paul speaking here, okay? Yes, they reflect what the Corinthians are thinking of him, but he's going ahead and acknowledging it. Yes, I'm inferior to the other apostles. Yes, I'm weak. You know what? I'm not worthy to be called an apostle. And in fact, I could add to that list. I'm worse than you think. The things you know about in my past, that's just the start. I've done so many things. You couldn't even imagine the things that Paul knew about himself that he did. He even adds that he, calls himself later in one of his letters, I'm the chief of sinners. Okay, he felt that way about himself. And this is actually what you see Paul doing. He glories in his weakness. God told him later in 2 Corinthians, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul responds, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You can't shake somebody who defines their life by grace. The more you point out their flaws, the more evidence you give of their cherished identity. I am defined by grace. So if I identify with grace, that means I identify with brokenness. If you, this morning, identify with grace, that means, first, that you identify with brokenness. Is that true of you? Can you take an honest look at your life and see the brokenness? Not just as a cliche. We all know the right answer. Say I'm a sinner, yeah, I'm broken, okay. But as a genuine evaluation of who you are, can you identify the broken pieces in your life? These are uncomfortable thoughts, okay? We don't like to dwell there. But if you never go there, you don't know God's grace. If you don't identify with brokenness, you don't identify with grace. Because if you aren't broken, God really has nothing to work with. God's grace loves to take broken things and make them into masterpieces. God's grace turns his greatest enemies into his greatest assets. Okay, that's what he did with Paul in Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9 says Saul was breathing out threats, murder to the disciples of the Lord. Then the Lord takes him by his grace and says, I choose you. You're one of the most broken people out there. You're one of my greatest enemies. I choose you. I'm going to take these broken pieces, I'm going to put them back together, and I'm going to create something beautiful by my grace. Paul is more aware of that than anybody, and that he knows is his identity. It's not about what I can do, it's about what God did. So the Corinthians say, you aren't worthy to be an apostle. But Paul says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. Okay, he's basically saying, okay, whatever I am, whether you want to acknowledge that I'm an apostle or not, I don't really care. You didn't give me this apostleship. God did by his grace. And so you can't take it from me. This is all just the result of the grace of God. That's who I am. And then think of what God's grace did in Naomi's life. She claims bitterness as her identity. But God, in his grace, gives her Ruth, a loyal friend. God, by his grace, brought a godly man, Boaz, into Ruth's life. God, by his grace, gives them a son. Ruth sat that son on Naomi's lap, and that son became her redemption. Now, all the women of the town look at Naomi. Naomi, the bitter one, the empty one, the childless one, the bitter one, the broken one. And they say, a son has been born to Naomi. God's grace says, you think you can summarize your life in one word, bitter? Let me show you another word to identify your life by. Grace. That son was the great-grandfather of one of the greatest kings in Israel's history, David. And in that line, another son would also be born in Bethlehem, who would be the greatest demonstration of grace in history as he hung on a cross, bearing our sin, turning his greatest enemies into his greatest assets. That is the grace of God. That's Paul's story. That's Naomi's story. And if you're a child of God, if you're defined by grace, that's your story. You identify both with brokenness and with restoration. If you identify with grace this morning, it means you identify with brokenness. It also means you identify with restoration. Is that true of you? Is that the most important thing in your life? Is that how you find your worthiness, your credibility, your value? Or do you find that in your achievements? You find it in what people say of you? Or do you find it in God's gracious gifts to you? Grace means you are not the sum of your actions. You are the sum of God's actions toward you. That's who you are. Grace means you are not the sum of your actions. You are the sum of God's actions towards you. That is defining your life by grace. Grace as a concept can be a little abstract sometimes. I want to make this a little more concrete for us. What are God's actions towards you? What is his grace on a day-to-day basis, okay? Now remember, the word grace and the word gift are related. So God's grace is just his benevolent attitude towards you. It's all the things that he gives you, pouring out of his nature. So that does include, for sure, the gift of Jesus Christ. He was the perfect sinless one. And when he told his disciples what he was about to do, he symbolized it by the breaking of a loaf of bread and said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." He was broken to make our restoration possible. So if you recognize your need for God's grace this morning, if you know your own brokenness, the first step for you is calling out to God, asking him to apply his son's perfect, unbroken life to your brokenness to make you whole, and he will. That is the most significant act of God's grace. But to make this further concrete and to show that this does continue, God's grace does not stop there. It's not a one-time thing that we look back on and that was his grace and it's over. No, God's grace continues every day of our lives. We should be aware of the other gifts that God is giving to us day by day to continue that work of restoration. We are still projects in process. So God brings people, circumstances, things in our lives. These are all demonstrations of his grace. The summary of what these gifts create in you becomes your identity. Grace means you are not the sum of your actions, you are the sum of God's actions toward you. If that's you this morning, if you identify with both brokenness and restoration, then that changes everything. Which leads me to my last question: what should I do about it? Okay, we've talked about what does not define me, what does define me. Now, what should I do about it? Please look at verse 10 and notice the implications of grace on the rest of Paul's life. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. So grace is not just a miracle in the past. It is an ongoing miracle. It's not that grace defined me, past tense. Grace defines me currently, every day of my life. I'm living out a new identity in grace. So what does that look like? What does it look like to embody God's grace in my identity on a day-to-day basis? Well, first, it means that my mindset is grace. My mindset is grace. So for one, it means that even when you're dealing with those difficult people in your life, whether it is an angry teenager, whether it is a parent, whether it is a coworker, boss, the difficult people in your life. You don't have to withdraw. Let them just give up and do whatever they want. You don't have to come in guns blazing, put them in their place. You have a new mindset. You are defined by grace, which leads to new habits. Some of those habits have to do with being towards people. I don't have to be my old self. I don't have to be my old self, which tried to control people's opinions of me, try to constantly prove myself, oversensitive to people's comments, overthinking everything. This is exhausting. It leads to anxiety. I often was defending myself, pointing out other people's failures to compensate for my own. Okay, those are the reactions of somebody who doesn't define their life by grace. That doesn't have to be you. Because I'm defined by grace, I can respond with confidence, poise, like Paul did. You can't possibly make me feel worse than I already know is true of me because I identify with brokenness. Because I identify with brokenness, because that's part of my identity through the Lord, that he looked at me in broken pieces of my life and brought me to restoration. I'm more aware of that than anybody. And that's okay. You can point that out and it's not going to bug me. I own it. As part of my identity, praise the Lord. Let me tell you what he's done with my life. It might change some habits towards my circumstances, whereas my old self may have tried to control my circumstances, control every job opportunity, relationship, event. But we find out we can't do that, and some things don't go my way, so I fill my mind with toxic thoughts like, I'm not good enough. Why should I even try? Just give up, and this can lead to frustration, discouragement, even depression. But because I'm defined by grace, I can trust that the same God who took me when I was broken and put me back together will also continue guiding all the events of my life toward restoration. That's what he's doing. That's what he's continuing to do. And I can trust him and I can yield control of the events of my life to that God who's more interested in my restoration than I am. And I can have peace in that. It might change some habits towards my past as well. Whereas my old self was ashamed and embarrassed of things I've done. And this could have led to either one of two directions of reactions. Either I was paralyzed and it prevented me from finding a path forward. Or it could be the opposite. It propelled me to have to prove myself all the time. In front of everybody's eyes, even to God and to whoever, I have to prove myself, make up for my failures, do enough good to cover out my bad. Or it could be the opposite. It could be that my old self was proud of my past. I was constantly trying to impress people with my list of credentials and achievements. But because I'm defined by grace, I can get off the hamster wheel. I don't have to live my life proving myself, listing my achievements, trying to impress people. I'm not impressive. I'm not trying to be impressive. Whatever you say about me, positive or negative, doesn't make a difference because it's about not my actions, but God's actions towards me. All those things can paralyze us, but God's grace mobilizes us. Look at verse 10. His grace toward me was not in vain. I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God with me. Okay, take that first phrase. His grace toward me was not in vain. Interesting idea. How can God's grace be in vain? Can it? Scripture is clear that God does not do anything in vain, okay? It's not that what he's doing is in vain, but our response to it can, it almost sounds weird putting it this way, render it vain, at least in our lives. What he's doing is always for a purpose and never in vain, but for our purposes towards our life and for our ministry and our purpose here in life, yes, we can definitely make God's grace in vain for ourselves. So how do you turn the grace of God in vain? Well, if God's grace are his gifts, the things he gives you, what are your reactions to his grace? Do you resist them? Do you ignore them? If you do either of those things, then you are rendering the grace of God vain in your life. Or are you using your gifts for God's kingdom? So let's read the rest of the verse. His grace toward me was not in vain, but I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Okay, now we read this phrase and we're like, okay, is Paul being proud here? Well, okay, if you know the context, he's obviously, that's not the point here. He's not saying I'm better than them, the other apostles, because I worked harder. He calls himself in the same passage, I'm the least of the apostles, right? Okay, so his focus is on the productivity and the effects of his gospel work. And he's quick to acknowledge that this is all the result of God's grace anyway. This, yet not I, but the grace of God in me. The reason I'm able to work harder is because of the grace of God enabling me to do so. It has made me into the kind of person. It's taken those broken pieces, restored them to the point to where I am ambitious for the kingdom of God. But even my ambition is just a reflection of the grace of God at work in my life. For all of us, I hope we can take a fresh glimpse of the grace of God in our lives. Sometimes we feel like we're struggling. Sometimes we even wallow in our struggling. And we forget how much grace is at our disposal, okay? We're like the proverbial fish in the water, okay, that doesn't know what water is, okay? You all are swimming in grace this morning, let me tell you. God's grace is so abundant. If you remember my illustration from last sermon, we're the spoiled rich kids of the universe. You remember that? The angels didn't get the grace we got. They look at us and say, oh my goodness, that blows my mind. These people have so much grace, and yet we're here on earth being like, God, I need more grace. I don't have enough. Okay. The angels laugh at us. We have so much grace at our disposal. We're breathing grace. Grace defines you, whether you define yourself that way or not. Okay? You are a restoration of God's grace. That's who you are. You could choose to acknowledge that and identify yourself that way or not. But if you're a Christian this morning, that defines you. God's grace is so abundant, and anyone who has an accurate awareness of the abundant grace of God will be ambitious for him, like Paul here, when he's saying, I labored more than them all. He's not saying it for his pride's sake. He's saying, hey, this is awesome. Look what God can do in someone's life. I was so ambitious and killing Christians before. God turned that around and made me ambitious for him. Praise the Lord. God can do incredible things through grace-filled people. The potential is limitless. So we have to know that our mindset is grace, our motivation is grace, and also our method is grace. As we're trying to remember, okay, what does it look like for grace to define me in every area of my life? Okay, yes, it's my mindset, it's my motivation, it's also my method. How does Paul go about sharing this message of grace? He explains in 1 Corinthians 2, my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So do you live your life in such a way that draws attention to yourself or to the grace of God? Our method as we go about our lives must be grace. It's not about me. It's not about impressing people. Even in ministry, even if you're sharing the gospel or something, it's not about how great you are sharing the gospel. It's about what God can do, drawing attention to his grace. And then finally, our message is grace. Our message is grace. We have to realize at the end of the day, along with Paul, that if God can be gracious to me, he can be gracious to anyone. Everyone needs that message of grace, even cranky people like the Corinthians. It was through the runt of an apostle, Paul, that the Corinthians came to faith. God used him that way. So let me almost summarize Paul's entire point here of the whole passage. if you deny the foundational truths of the gospel, like the resurrection, which if you're familiar with 1 Corinthians 15, that's what the whole chapter is about. Okay, if you're gonna deny foundational truths of the resurrection like that, then you are erring from the heritage, this whole lineage of grace-filled apostles and eyewitnesses, which Paul is saying, of which I'm a part, by the grace of God, and your faith may be in vain. Okay, looking at that from a bird's eye perspective, let me ask you this question. Can you say, kind of along with Paul, is your life such a powerful demonstration of God's grace that others would be scared to leave the faith because of the testimony in your life? Your testimony of God's grace is so evident and attractive that even when other people have doubts or struggles, they see your life and say, this is powerful. This is magnetic. I want that too. If God can take somebody like that and make them somebody like that, there must be truth to this. This is powerful. This is not natural. This is supernatural. And it compels them towards that. It's magnetic. Is your life that kind of demonstration? Again, not because of our own pride, but because of the grace of God that can do that in our lives, and that's how we identify ourselves. That is God's goal for us. God's grace not only works in us to put us back together, it works through us to help put other people back together. What a privilege. What a privilege it is that God not only takes us from brokenness to restoration, but part of that restoration means I am helping other broken people become restored. That's incredible, that God can do that in broken people like us. And I would just caution us this morning, if this morning you are not interested in sharing the message of grace with other people, you should ask yourself if you've experienced God's grace at all. That's part of our identity. That's who we are. That's who He's making us to be. Let's be ambitious about sharing this message of grace with others. So I would just encourage you this morning this way. As you're thinking about God's grace, as you're thinking about what grace is there in my life, don't compare yourself to other people and say, I wish I had grace like them, or I wish I had grace like them, or all these ways that we can be paralyzed and stuck. Ask yourself, where is the grace in my life today? Who has He made me to be today? Remember, you're swimming in grace, okay? So just take a moment to recognize it, to use it, allow it to turn you into something beautiful, which is what God's grace is trying to do. Don't ignore it or resist it, rendering that grace in vain, but labor for Him. Become ambitious by grace. Live out your new identity by grace. Grace should pervade everything that you do. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. Grace is such a mind-boggling concept. There's few words in existence that I could feel confident about just identifying my whole life by, but grace is one of them. So what is the most important thing about you? What is the most important thing about Josh Till? Well, it must be that we define our lives by grace. Let's pray.